the cloud. Okay. Promote to panelist. It's been a day, guys.
You're doing great.
Okay, so yes, please. I'm going to. Okay, people are joining. All right, so it is working again. So please take it away. I'm going to say it all again. Welcome to our pen names panel. It is my pleasure to introduce Nick and Jerry and Aurora and Trevor. And we're not going to cut into their time anymore, so take it away.
All right. You guys can hear me this time. So we are going to be talking about pen names or people who wrote and published under names other than their own more generally. And I'm going to start us off with the most ancient version of this, which is a very broad genre of writing called pseudepigrapha. Pseudo meaning false, epigrapha meaning to write on. Basically, an ancient word for false writing that is used to describe texts that were attributed to people other than the actual author. Sometimes this was intentional, like a guy we remember as Pseudo Herodotus, who wrote a Life of Homer, directly claims to be the historian Herodotus in the text. Other times it's complete attribution by later audiences, like the actual Homer, who probably wasn't a real person at all. The most famous version of this is in the context of biblical writing. Like I just said, there's also ancient Greek, there's ancient Roman. You could make a case to attribute pseudepigrapha as a label for many other cultures, but that's the broad idea. In the biblical context, this includes things that are both considered canonical and some that are not. For example, the book of Daniel is generally considered to be pseudepigrapha by historians because it is very reflective of the 2nd century or 3rd century BC, approximately 300 years after it's supposedly set. Another example would be The Assumption of Moses, which is a non-canonical book of prophecies written supposedly by Moses, the ancient patriarch, as he was dying, but it lists extraordinarily accurate lists of historical figures like Hasmonean kings and describes social issues relating to the Hellenization of ancient Judea by Greek rulers. And this is something that continued well into the 17th century. A text purportedly written by Aristotle, known as Aristotle's Masterpiece, is a sexual health manual and midwifery textbook popularized in 1684. And the reason people kept choosing to attribute or assume the names of ancient authors is because it was an appeal to antiquity as a form of gaining more legitimacy for their own writing. You can take Herodotus seriously because that's a well-known established figure, but maybe, Theodosius of Smyrna or something, whoever actually wrote it, we don't know, wasn't quite as impressive. That is the broad strokes of ancient pseudepigrapha.
Nice.
I think we're passing to Jerry next.
Yes, I will go ahead and fast forward into much later in history because I am Jerry Landry. I'm the host of the Presidencies of the United States. So most of my work is based around the time of the early republic right now. But pen names and pseudonyms were utilized going back into the revolutionary times. And just like anything, just like with any convention that becomes popular, there were different reasons why people would adopt a pseudonym in order to be able to publish something in newspapers, in pamphlets, to be able to share information. And we see in the revolution, of course, safety and security. If you're advocating for basically declaring independence from the British government, your life is potentially at risk. So you wouldn't necessarily want to put your name to that because you want to be safe, you want your family to be safe. And so it became popular. But with that, and for anybody who studies the Revolutionary and early Republic periods of American history, you're going to come across so many examples of pen names, particularly Roman pen names. And part of that, they would adopt these pen names, these pseudonyms, to be able to speak to kind of their political philosophy. If you're talking about, wanting reluctant leaders and you're wanting somebody who's willing to give up power, you may adopt Cincinnatus. You want something, you want to be able to draw on, and like Trevor was saying, kind of drawing on that previous ancient experience or ancient thought. They really focused in on the Roman Republic as kind of a thought leader as they were crafting what became the American Republic. But you also see some other pen names as well, and some of it, typically it's around like this idea of farming, rural life. So there are some non-Roman pen names and pseudonyms, but you see a lot of Roman names that are used in this context. And of course, the most famous one is Publius, which was the pen name that was used by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison in crafting what would come to be known as the Federalist Papers. And in that case, you see that three people are trying to speak using the same vehicle. And so, of course, they didn't want to put any one of their names on there. So they shared that pseudonym. But then also you have to think about the context of the culture of the time and why it kept going into the early republic. So this culture was very based around this idea of honor. And especially if you're going to attack somebody personally, you don't want to associate your name to it because that's going to lead to a duel. And indeed, we see in the most famous example of a duel, the Hamilton-Burr duel, it all started because a letter from somebody talking about something that Alexander Hamilton said at a party was published. And word got back to Burr. He was, of course, he saw it as an attack on his honor, and we end up on the dueling ground. And so you want to be able to avoid that as well. But also this idea, going back to this idea of Cincinnatus, you didn't want to be seen at the time, if you're a political leader, as being too ambitious. You didn't want to necessarily put yourself out there to be able to, have folks think, oh, well, this person's trying to take power. So some folks saw this as a way to be able to avoid that while still getting their names out there, well, getting their ideas out there. But then also you have this idea of just wanting the ideas to stand on their own. You don't necessarily want somebody to be able to, they're so focused about the personality that they ignore the ideas or they come in with assumptions. And so for many reasons, folks would adopt pseudonyms, and it would carry through in American political culture. And these pseudonymic writings would become a big part of the political dialogue and discourse of the time. And so if you study the Revolution, the early Republic period, you're going to come across a lot of these. Most we've been able to identify, but there are still some that are mysteries because somebody just didn't take credit for it. They didn't write about it in a letter. We just have no way of knowing for certain who this is. So it's just an interesting turn of using these pseudonyms, and it really contributed to a larger political discourse. And so I'm going to stop speaking now. I'm going to hand it over to my fellow panelists, but I look forward to any questions you may have about that and look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thanks so much, Jerry. That was great. So I'm Nick, and my background is actually I'm a musicologist. So I'm going to talk about sort of the use of pseudonyms in the music world. And the use of pseudonyms throughout the music world is prolific. And there are many reasons as to why a musician may choose to operate under a name other than their own, such as the desire to avoid conflict if they're doing something a little racy, if they wish to separate their stage self from their personal self, if their name is super common for marketing purposes, and so based off of that, I want to talk about the early jazz age and the use of pseudonyms as a marketing technique during that time. So it's a widely accepted fact that organizations are going to deceive their consumers into purchasing their products. That's something I think we can all accept as truth. And many studies have gone into how and why they do this. But for our purposes, we understand pseudonyms as deceptive acts used by jazz record companies to reinforce and heighten the role that they play in the early jazz market. So during the rise of the jazz age, many recordings released by key record companies were re-releases of songs by artists that the same record company had already recorded previously, but were now re-releasing under pseudonyms. And to understand why, we also have to understand sort of how jazz culture was created. So back in the day, there were two main ideas of jazz. There was highbrow jazz and lowbrow jazz. And to speak plainly, it was white jazz versus black jazz. And lowbrow jazz is understood to be Black and Creole musicians in smaller groups of maybe 5 to 7 who are doing more improv based off of standards. And highbrow jazz is understood to be larger groups of classically trained white musicians who would play more symphonic arrangements, pre-written, less improv. There was still some, but it was mostly still based on different jazz techniques. So if you're thinking swing is the easiest one to sort of pinpoint. But since the beginning of time, cultural elites have always been concerned with separating high and low culture in general, but there was special attention paid to jazz cultures, as the origin of jazz was deemed to be illegitimate and was often associated with illicit activity that was told to accompany whenever the music was performed. Many individuals involved in the elite music press associated jazz with the downfall of civilization, and that jazz wasn't even worthy of being considered as music. So many record companies would repackage lowbrow jazz under highbrow jazz names to appeal to both markets. Some examples being Louis Armstrong and his Savoy Ballroom 5 being re-released as simply Eddie Gordon's Band, or Ezra Buzzington's Rustic Revelers being re-released as Joseph Simpkins and his Rube Band. So the use of these pseudonyms by jazz record companies were used as a way to preserve the company's image while marketing and selling these identity-threatening products. The idea that a highbrow record company would be producing lowbrow jazz was reputation ruining at the time. Market leaders wanted to be associated with highbrow jazz and other symphonic forms of what was becoming popular music. However, when it came to the taste of the everyday music consumer, in clubs and dance communities, the most often requested form of music was jazz songs, artists, and styles that were all associated with lowbrow jazz. Even those who were considered white and middle class were preferring the stylistic techniques of lowbrow jazz. This is in addition to many Black songwriters having their music stolen and re-recorded by white musicians. Big Mama Thornton originally recorded Hound Dog, which is more famously attributed to Elvis Presley. And other songs attributed to Elvis that were written by Black musicians include All Shook Up, Don't Be Cruel, and Return to Sender, all originally recorded by Otis Blackwell. During this period, it was common for Black and white musicians to play together, but it was always in secret during after-hours jam sessions. Benny Goodman was the first white man to ever hire a Black musician to be part of his group, and that wasn't until 1935. But by the 1940s, it was becoming more and more common to see Black and white musicians performing together on stage. So I want to conclude my section with a quote from jazz historian Stanley Crouch saying, "Once the musicians who played it and the listeners who loved it began to balk at the limitations imposed by segregation, jazz became a futuristic social force in which one was finally judged purely on the basis of one's individual ability. Jazz predicted the civil rights movement more than any other art form in America." And with that, I pass it on to Aurora.
Hello, I'm Aurora, and today I'm going to be talking about authors, of course. Being the books person, we're going to talk about sort of pen names for authors. Now, there's all sorts of authors use pen names for all sorts of different reasons. I'm focusing on a very specific sort of usage, and that is often, particularly within fantasy, but sci-fi as well, female authors choosing either androgynous or male pen names. This is not uncommon. It's not all of them do it, and it's becoming less frequent now than it was in the past. But it is particularly prevalent in fantasy for female authors to pick male names. Now, why would you do this? Well, a couple reasons. The main one being sexism. Sexism from a couple sources. Number one, from publishers, and number two, from consumers. Within the publishing industry, it is simply a fact, as with many industries, it is often harder to get ahead in certain genres if you are a female author or a female artist, whatever your genre, whatever your chosen profession is. Female authors are often tried to be siloed off into YA, or they're siphoned off into like children's books, stuff like that. They're not taken as seriously by publishers as, authors, writers of fiction. Even once you get past the publishers, there's the question of the audience. Now, a lot of readers don't care, and that's great. But there is, particularly in the past and even to today, is a large subsection of the audience who expects their fantasy or their genre fiction to be written by men. And so in order to avoid that, and again, simply to be successful as an author, you have a lot of female authors picking generic either, again, androgynous or masculine names. There are a few famous examples. One of them is a person I will not name, but who had one of the most popular fantasy series ever sold, who particularly picked an androgynous sounding name in order so that people wouldn't know she was a woman when she wrote those books. You can probably guess who she is. However, I want to focus on a particular author, one I like a lot, who goes by the name of Robin Hobb. Robin Hobb wrote the Assassin's Apprentice trilogy, Realm of the Elderlings. Now, obviously, that's not Robin Hobb's legal name, but what her actual name is kind of doesn't matter. What I want to focus on is why she picked Robin Hobb. Like, where did this name come from? She admits she had written under different names previously when she released some of her earlier fantasy books. And so we're going to focus on here is legitimacy and marketing. In an interview she gave to Lightspeed Magazine, she talks about the fact that because The Assassin's Apprentice was sort of a new flavor of fantasy she hadn't written before, she thought she should pick a new name so it's not associated with anything she wrote before, to give her sort of like a clear lane, so she's no longer associated with her previous work. So she's like, well, I need a new name. And she had a process for this. First thing she did was she went and walked around a whole bunch of bookstores and looked at the way books were on the shelves. And she determined that more often than not, H last names are stocked on a shelf that is about eye level. So she picked the last name Hobb because it would be generally at eye level for a lot of consumers, and it would put her in the same area as Heinlein and Herbert and Hemley. So she picked the last name that would put her at eye level and among with other already famous authors. Okay. And then she picked Robin, spelled with an I, because it's more often seen as masculine as opposed to Robin with a Y. And as she put it, her expected quote is, so I said, okay, I want a surname that starts with H, and I want it to be short enough to fit on the cover. So I deliberately chose Robin as an androgynous name because there's still readers who, if you are writing a first-person male, they expect the book to be written by a male. So I chose a fairly androgynous name. It gave me lots of room for the reader to step over that threshold and start reading. So this whole idea that she was like, well, for marketing purposes, I need people to see it, so it's going to be an H. I want it to fit on the front cover, so it's got to be short. Okay, well, now it's got to be male. She's a pretty extreme example of this, but again, you can see it from other authors that choose to go by acronyms like N.K. Jemisin. Those are people who have chosen this because it tries to remove any inherent bias from readers or publishers when it comes to doing their book. Again, I want to say in recent years, this has gotten a lot better. It's not nearly as common as it was for like women that were trying to write sci-fi in like the 50s or 60s for all those sci-fi magazines. But obviously it's still an issue. up into like the current day. Before I finish, I would like to lay out for everyone sort of something we talked about as an overriding theme for all of us, is that often, or sort of the connecting tissue between all of these, is people pick pen names a lot of times for legitimacy. Be it someone, in ancient history using the same name as a different ancient historian to make their work be taken more seriously, be it someone in the revolution picking a Roman name because the Romans were famous, and also because, again, disconnecting it from you would let your idea stand on its own. It would be more legitimate if it wasn't coming from, John Adams, who everybody hated. Or, if it's a musician, we're making it sound like it's a white band because that adds it more legitimacy to the publisher, or whether it's a woman trying to sound more legitimate by being pretending to be male. All of these times people are changing their names. It's simply to improve the legitimacy of whatever it is they're writing. And I think that's interesting. Sometimes it's by making it more yourself or making it less yourself. And all of it is sort of a way to codify like the legitimacy of your work. I think that's sort of an interesting sort of theme to pull together from all of our like presentations. And that's it. And so I think I'll shut up for now and everyone can like ask questions or whatever.
Well done, guys. I really enjoyed that. I love that you brought in so many different aspects and really talked about the intentions behind pen names. I have a question that I'll kick it off with while we wait for some more. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat. How often do we actually see collaborative pen names, like we're talking about here with Publius? What's the benefit of legitimating yourself as a collaborative group under a single name?
Well, I can tell you off the bat, there's a few authors in fiction that are multiple authors that write as a single name because it's easier to market it as a single author than it is multiple authors. James A. McCarthy, that's two guys.
Okay.
Writing collaboratively for all those books. So that it's not super common, but it does happen. And I think in fiction anyway, that's just because they don't want to put two names in the title for the Robin Hobb reasons, right? That's too much stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You pick it's like giving your band a single name as opposed to calling it John and Paul and George and Ringo. You're just being like, oh, this is just James A. McCarthy. Bam, you've got it.
Well, and I'll say from the context of the Revolution and early Republic, it's very rare. And one of the reasons for that, it actually goes to my presentation earlier today. It's if you've got too many people involved in something that you're trying to keep secret, you can pretty much count on somebody's going to end up spilling the beans somewhere. And so it wasn't that common, but you do see some collaborative efforts behind the scenes. And that's part of how we know who some of these pseudonyms, who the person really was writing. Case in point, Thomas Jefferson would never adopt a pseudonym himself, but he'd write James Madison and say, hey, I just saw this article. You should respond. Or Hamilton just said this. Why don't you write an article about this? And here's some talking points that you can use. So really more of the collaboration was happening behind the scenes, but it was pretty rare that, multiple authors would use the same name.
So early ghostwriting.
Exactly.
On that same note, Ben asks, how about the opposite situation where multiple people are using the same name but not liking what the other person is saying, like the two guys writing under Cincinnatus, one a Federalist and one a Republican?
And so I haven't seen too many instances of that. Typically, they'd want to be able to distinguish, okay, well, I'm responding to this person, so they wouldn't necessarily use that name, and they'd try and keep some names out of circulation if it was something that was in one of the major prominent newspapers, unless they really want it to be associated with that. But typically, even though they were trying to keep their anonymity, they still wanted it to be seen as distinctive. And so they pull out their Roman history textbooks and go in, okay, well, this one hasn't been used for a while. Let's go ahead and use this one.
You mean we wouldn't have the real Cincinnatus and the provisional Cincinnatus?
I haven't seen any instances of that, but that would be good.
Will the real Cincinnatus please stand up? Um, so what about backlash? What happens? Like, where are we seeing the responses to just the discovery of a pen name? Because we know in there are cases in history where that has been so closely guarded that people have hired private investigators to source out these who's really behind these pen names. What's happening in the backlash to these ideas? I'm curious about that in regards to music as well.
I don't know if there was ever like I think it just sort of fell out of fashion in
Mm.
terms of like using like whiter sounding names in terms of jazz and stuff. I think it just sort of but like nowadays it's more common I find with like if you're on the internet like a bunch of like nameless creators or faceless creators being like who is that? We need to figure out we need to
Mhm.
see them, you know, and you find that less with musicians because every musician wants everyone to know what their face looks like.
Yeah. And even those who use false names are very open about the fact that they use false
Yeah,
names
like we all
now.
know what Chapel Roan's real name is.
Mhm. Can I say though, it's I think it's related to this though that like occasionally people like a lot of these anonymous accounts you can find out what their real name is, but sometimes people just collectively decide they don't care
Yeah.
because it's
Mm-hmm.
funnier to not do it. I remember, this paints me as old, but years ago there was like a collective effort for people to find out who was behind uh the Twitter account Drill. Like, early famous Twitter account poster Drill. There was an effort to figure out who was behind Drill. And eventually somebody did all this work and figured it out. And the internet collectively went, yeah, we don't care. It's funnier if we don't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's like there was like sort of a public collective decision to ignore the fact that we had learned who this was, that we'd seen behind the pen name because it was everyone enjoyed it more when we pretended we didn't know. And I think that's sort of an interesting flip on that. There wasn't an outrage, but they were more outraged that somebody had gone through the effort to figure it out.
Well, that's. Did it come through? Yeah. Okay. That's really not that different from a lot of the ancient examples, especially the more theological ones, where 200 years worth of historians and linguists and other types of scholar go through and pick out every single word and analyze grammar and references and quotations. But at the end of the day, if it's tied to religion, the people who religiously believe that the Gospel of Luke was written by an ancient physician named Luke are going to continue to believe that. Same goes for especially a lot of the Old Testament stuff. And it doesn't really impact the people who want to continue not analyzing it like that anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But the corpus of information is then out there.
Well, then we have to talk about Apocrypha, and that's a whole other discussion. Does Jesus have a twin brother?
Well, and
Okay,
and
I
I'll
say the
say
chat
from
is.
the. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, I was referencing the chat. They're asking about like Gorillaz or Daft Punk, like bands that sort of obscure their members. I would say though that Nick, however, we do know who was in Daft Punk. They were. You could always look up who they were. It was more sort of a struggle to find out what they looked like.
Mm-hmm.
They were much more secretive about what they actually looked like because then they could walk around in public without being ID'd. It's not that you didn't know their names; it's that you didn't know their faces.
Mm-hmm.
One of them has a fairly normal name. The other one has the most French name for a man I've ever heard in my life. His name's like Guy Manuel. He's like Thomas Guy Manuel Bangalter or something. It's an incredibly French name. But so I think for them it's much more of a like, can I walk around in public without being noticed, as opposed to, do you know what my legal name is?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone knows the Gorillaz is just Damon Albarn.
Yeah, that's just my guy.
Well, and I'll say in terms of repercussions, and it was really more in the Revolutionary era that there were potential, there were attempts to try and figure out, okay, well, who is this kind of stirring things up? British officials and British military folks maybe trying to figure out who it was. But really, in the early republic, and especially when you get into more of the political dialogue back and forth, it's almost like a gentleman's agreement that, well, we're not going to out so and so as the author of this because I'm writing these articles and I don't want anybody to know who I am. But you would see behind the scenes folks trying to guess. Like there was an essay series. It was the pseudonym was Publicola, and you see Jefferson and Madison going back and forth, and oh well, this is John Adams. It's got to be John Adams. It wasn't. It was his son, John Quincy. But they didn't learn until years down the line that it was John Quincy, and so they just had in their mind, oh well, John Adams is up to it again.
Excellent. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. So does anybody have any final statements they want to make? No?
I mean, I guess you could consider my name a pen name or an alias, I guess. So I guess the practice is still alive and well, even for people that aren't writing.
No, that's a fair point. Although you're not trying to be anonymous with it either.
No, but I mean, it is sort of working to hide, like, I guess, my legal name, I suppose.
Well, and maybe there's a discussion to be had there about the idea of initially pen names being something about concealing for legitimacy, but now we can use pen names or chosen names as a tool of empowerment or to be more legitimate to our authentic selves or something like that. Because there are a number of reasons to change your name to better represent yourself, and not all of them are deceptive.
I mean, I'm doing it to avoid my creditors, but you know.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Where it's like, yeah, all that, but
all that, but I just owe a lot of money, so I figured I'd change it. Like it's like it's 1870, and I can just change cities now and be a new person.
Tripp's calling you out for tax evasion.
Look.
The FBI's in our chat.
Look, we've already talked about sending the secret police after Zoom today. It's all we're putting it all out there.
Look, if there's a bounty, Aurora has doxed herself to me on Patreon, so
oh, you're about to be sold up the river.
Oh,
close. You made it this far.
Well, thank you so much, panelists, for being here today. Really enjoyed that discussion. If you are in the audience and you have further questions for our panelists, the lobby chat's a great place to do it. And also bring all your questions to the after party because it's going to be a riot. If you are hanging out, there is another panel coming in about 6 or 7 minutes. So come join us there. And thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.